Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 1691. The topic is Q&A and the title is, what is the best head position for squat and deadlift? Ooh. So we had a listener reach out. Yay. I love when everybody reaches out and sends emails, so thank you to everybody who does communicate. It's fun to hear from everybody. It's just super cool to see where people are listening from. That's actually one of the things that kind of like makes the most fun for me, is just getting emails from all over the world, which is really freaking fun. So this listener, they're from New Zealand, by the way, and they sent in a question. They said they watched a how to squat video recently, and the video recommended, the person was an elite powerlifter, like world record type holder type powerlifter, and they recommended that when you squat, that your eye line, like where you look, should be like kind of parallel with the floor, like you should look out on the horizon. That way your head position was always like as if you were standing normal. Your head is I don't even know, like, is that horizontal, vertical? I don't have a clue. But if you're standing and you're a normal human being, your head is kind of in that fixated point. What they said is as you squat, it should stay as if you're looking straight ahead. Now, what happened was, whenever this listener tried that position, they said their squat actually felt worse. It caused lower back pain, and their knees were caving in. And they're like, I've never, ever had trouble with that. Never had back pain, never had their knees cave in. And they typically were looking downward, kind of looking more like down at the floor. And they saw this video and they were like, well, this guy's an elite, powerlifter, I should do what they do. But they tried it and it made their squat worse. So they wanted to reach out and ask, why might that be the case? Why would something that an elite powerlifter do, like what they do, why would that make this person weaker and or kind of their technique worse? They said, is it something I should stick with, and maybe I'm just not developed enough, so I'm not on that same powerlifter level, so maybe I just need to stick with it longer to make it work? My answer was no, don't do that. I had them send me a video, and they were absolutely correct in having their head downward when they squatted because it did match their body type. So then we got into a question. There's like, well, how the hell did you know that? And I was like, well, that's a great question. So what we got into, which I wanted to share in today's podcast, was I'll give you tips on the kind of head positioning, but also just the idea that what works for one person doesn't always work for another. So technique cues, when you're giving somebody cues on how to squat, deadlift, bench press, any exercise it might be, the cues should either be specific to the individual that you're talking to, or they be specific to body type. What happened was, the video they watched was a powerlifter that has they're a very compact person. They have very short legs, very short torso, just a very kind of like an even blend. But the listener has really long legs. They're like kind of gangly looking. And they would laugh because that's the words they use. So I'm not calling them that. They call themselves that. But they have long limbs. So they were watching somebody who was built different than them, different body type. So the cues for the person with the different body type felt different. That would make sense. But it's a bummer because the elite powerlifter didn't mention that. They just said everyone who squats, their strongest position is going to be with their eye line to the horizon. Their head should always be neutral with the floor. And I was like, well, that sucks because that's horrible advice. That is not true. That's just flat out not true. And this listener unfortunately paid the price for finding out why that's not true, is their back hurt and their squat went to crap. So advice for technique for squat and deadlift. This is why I love doing one-on-one coaching, is because I give the advice specific to the individual I'm working with. Now, when I do coaching cues and some other things, I try to find, if I'm talking to like general population, I try to find ways to explain it based on body type. This is why in some past podcasts, we've done like podcasts on how to personalize like your chest training or how to personalize your back training. And we were talking about how to make changes based on, say, upper arm length. If you have a long upper arm bone or a short upper arm bone, that would change how those movements feel, like back movements and chest movements. We have a podcast, it's like podcast 1554, is a training podcast titled How to Personalize Your Leg Training. And that was also kind of dependent on limb length. So femurs, if you have a long femur, short femur, which is your upper leg bone. So those are fun podcasts because I try to give perspective on how to personalize things. So we have podcast 1563. It's a training podcast titled How to Personalize Your Bench Press Training. So that would be a fun way to kind of learn, okay, if I have a certain body type, this is the way I should position myself on a bench press. These are the movements I should do to try to build my bench press. Very fun stuff. So technique should be specific to the person you're talking to or the body type of the person you're talking to. So I want to give an example. One of my clients is a female powerlifter, and she has really long femurs. Really long femurs. She's not like abnormally weird, but she has very long femurs, and she doesn't have a super short torso either. She's kind of a lot of legs and a lot of torso. She's just like a taller type person. I think she's like 5'10". So long. Now, what happens with her squat is her hips are built to where her stance has to be relatively narrow. At shoulder width, maybe a smidge wider than shoulder width, but she can't do a super wide position because that causes hip impingement. So she doesn't have like wide set or kind of angled outward hip sockets. Her hip sockets are more kind of neutral. If anything, they're probably angled more forward. So she doesn't have a wide stance, and she has super long legs, like femurs. So she has to have an extreme hinge position when she squats. It's almost like her belly has to come down in between her thighs. She almost has to fold over completely in order to get to parallel. That's really hard. Now, I actually have another female client built similarly. She has an elite total, so it has not been an issue. We can do this. I work with these people all the time. I love this kind of stuff because it's nuancy and fun and weird to try to figure out how to do all this stuff. So I've used this body type, like the one client that has elite total. She squatted over 300, deadlift over 300, benches 200, strongest yet. So very strong person, even though she has really long limbs. So you can definitely do this. But that type of body type, it requires that they basically fold in half to get down to parallel. Now, when her head is up, if she were to try to keep her eyes on the horizon, that would be an absolute train wreck. And that's actually what she used to do. So we're trying to fix that. What happened was when she kept her eyes up, it would take away from the body's need to hinge at the hips and really angle her torso down towards the ground. If your head is up, your chest wants to stay up. Therefore, your hips don't want to go back. So her hips weren't going as far back. Her torso was staying too upright. It was causing her to shift forward. Her bar path was like a diagonal line straight forward. It was awful. Awful. And unfortunately, the coaches she had before, no one ever freaking told her this. So the second we changed it, she's like, oh my God, like my knees feel better, my back feels better. She got a lot stronger, huge change. So sad that no one told her that beforehand. But the bar path was a diagonal line forward. She got shifted forward into her knees. It was over-reliant on her quadriceps and hip flexors and over-reliant on her lower back. She always had a stiff lower back. Just everything felt like crap. She would have a hard time hitting depth, and she had lower back pain. So just train wreck, all-around train wreck. Now, same thing when she does a deadlift. She, again, has a narrower set hips, so she can't do a wide sumo stance because that causes hip impingement and that causes hip pain. So we do a conventional stance deadlift. Now, when she has her head up, that overemphasizes her being into her toes, and that overemphasizes, again, the quads. So she has a great drive off the ground. Awesome. But the second the bar gets to like an inch or two below the kneecap, boom. It's like somebody put the brakes on the lift. The glutes and hamstrings aren't properly loaded from the bottom, therefore they don't get properly engaged and actually do their proper workload in that mid-range of the lift, so everything kind of stalls out. She tries to yank her head up, her chin up, and try to pull through her lower back. If she can finish the lift, it's horrible on her lower back and it feels like crap, or she isn't able to finish the lift. She isn't able to get the bar past her knees and actually get her hips to drive forward and lock out. So, when her eyes are on the horizon, when her head is neutral, like meaning it stays in the same position as if you're standing and talking, that's awful for her. Train wreck. So what we did was I told her to look down at the floor. I said, I want you to look at the floor. You can look between your feet. You can look maybe a foot or two in front of your feet, but look down at the floor. What I want her to do is I want her to, at the bottom of the squat, when she's fully at parallel, when she has proper mid-foot balance, she's not too far into her toes, not too far into her heels. If we were to just like kind of chop her head off and we were to just take the rest of the body and put her at a perfectly balanced parallel squat. Then, if we put her head back on, what I want her head to be is at the bottom of the squat is to be just in line with her spine. We would want it to look like the backbone and the neck are all in normal alignment. So she's just angled towards the floor, but if her chest is pointing to the floor, her eyes are pointing to the floor. We want her head to look like it's straight in line with her spine, which, since her torso is angled to the floor, it means her eyes and her face will be angled towards the floor. If her neck is in line with the spine, all of her problems go away. Her technique looks great. She's strong as shit. Everything goes well. What we're working on now is undoing the bad habits and building this new habit with the confidence that if I look at the floor, it doesn't mean I'm going to fall into the floor. So just because you're looking at the floor does not mean you're going to fall into the floor. So she has to work on that. What's funny is already she's feeling stronger, more stable, more balanced in her muscle and recruitment, no lower back pain. Everything feels great, but it's also just kind of new yet. So she's learning to build the confidence, learning to build that autopilot that when the weights get heavy, she doesn't revert back to the bad technique. But that is an example of someone who, given a body type, it requires that they look down at the floor, that they keep their neck in line with their spine throughout the change of position, throughout the change of torso angle through the squat and the deadlift. It would be disadvantageous. It would be a bad idea, a bad cue for her to look at the horizon throughout the entire lift. Train wreck. And that might be true for some people. Typically, the greater torso angle change that the person has to go through in order to get to parallel in a squat or in order to get to their proper starting position in the deadlift, the more that their chest has to kind of point to the floor, the better they'll do with keeping their neck in line with their spine, which means they're going to be looking down at the ground. So if you had a laser pointer coming out of your belly button, right? If as you squat, your belly button points to the floor, like the laser pointer would be pointing down at the floor, that's where you want to be looking. If you have short femurs, and or certain body types, you can have a short torso and it kind of still works. But if that laser pointer is pointing more straight ahead at the horizon, then it's okay to look at the horizon. Wherever the laser pointer would point is where you want to look. So wherever your belly button is pointing, that's where you want to look. That'll be good for most body types. That's pretty solid advice, actually. Just like pat myself on the back. Pretty good advice there. I think that's going to work very well for most people. Is wherever my belly button points is where I look. If you are able to squat or deadlift with an upright torso, then you're probably going to look and feel great looking at the horizon. However, if your torso angles to the floor, if your belly button points to the floor, then you're going to be better looking at the floor. Now, for squats, most people with short femurs, they tend to be able to have a very upright torso. They could probably look straight ahead. If you have long femurs, then you're probably going to need to keep your neck in line with the spine. You're probably going to need to look where your belly button is pointing, which means you're probably going to need to look at the floor. For a deadlift, it really kind of depends on your starting position. Whether you do sumo or conventional, when you get into proper starting position, your elbows are going to be right beside your knees. If you're conventional, your knees are going to be inside your elbows. If you're sumo, your knees are going to be on the outside of your elbows. When you're in that position, wherever your belly button is pointing, that's where you should be looking, or slightly up from that. And the reason why that's good in deadlift is it promotes you to kind of, as you're pushing through your legs, it promotes you to kind of push your chest and upper back backward, diagonally backward. A deadlift isn't so much pushing straight up as it actually is pushing angled back behind you. Sounds kind of weird, but you almost want to touch your back to the wall behind you as you stand up. And that's going to counter the center of gravity of the barbell, which is actually out in front of your center of gravity. So it's like a seesaw. You need to sit back in order for the bar to go straight up. If you try to go straight up, the bar is going to pull you forward, and it gets you in a bad position. So we do have, on YouTube, we do have videos for technique tips and stuff like that. So one video I want to point out is we have a helpful video for squats that is going to give you tips that help along with head positioning. So if you go to YouTube and you search Brutal Iron Gym, 3 tips for better bracing during squats. Okay? You're going to love that video. It's only 6 minutes, pretty quick. But again, that's Brutal Iron Gym, 3 tips for better bracing during squats. That's going to help a lot. You're going to really like that. So that'll be a good one for you. We also do have our conventional deadlift setup. That one, you'll kind of get a kick out of it. That's a really older video, so I might need to update that one. But I filmed that back in 2013. Oh gosh, 10 years ago. But the title for that one, you can just type Brutal Iron Gym conventional deadlift setup and breathing techniques. Now, we have a couple other ones. Let's see here. Actually, I like this one better. So scratch that. Brutal Iron Gym, conventional deadlift setup, and weakness training advice. That one's going to be a little more recent. That was 2018. And that one's just going to be kind of a cleaned up version of the older one. So again, for conventional deadlift technique, it's Brutal Iron Gym, conventional deadlift setup, and weakness training advice. That will help you. For those who do sumo deadlifts, we do have our kind of technique advice for that one. And that one is Brutal Iron Gym Quick Sumo Deadlift Tutorial. And it's only 3 minutes. Very fast, but very good information. Okay. Now, that will give you a lot of good kind of setup information and kind of positioning to go along with the head position. But the idea of what is the best head position for squat and deadlift is it's what's best for you. It depends on your body type. There is no one-size-fits-all universal advice. So when they watched that video and an elite powerlifter told them to keep their eyes on the horizon, horrible advice. It's going to work for people that are built like that person, and it's going to be horrible advice for people that are built differently than that person. So what works for them won't always work for you. Anytime you're watching tutorial videos, try to find somebody that has a very similar body type as you, and that'll help. And then also just pay attention to the cues that we give you in this podcast is, wherever your belly button is pointing is probably where you should look. That's a good general line. Okay. Hopefully that was helpful. Thought that was kind of fun to share. So if you do ever have any questions like this listener did, please reach out. I'm always here and I'm always happy to help. I love doing this. I love hearing from people. Again, it's motivational. It's never annoying. It's never overwhelming. I try to get back to everybody in 2 weeks of every email, and I've been doing great at that. I don't think I've missed anybody. So if I have missed you, please let me know. But I don't think I've missed anybody. But I love hearing from everybody. So thank you very, very much to those who reach out and send encouragement and just say, hey, love the podcast. That's super helpful. So thank you very much for doing that. Okay, if you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything you want to know, let me know. My email, brutalironjim@gmail.com. If you like the podcast, please share the podcast. The more people we share it with, the more people we can help. That's the whole point of the podcast. Thank you to those who donate to support the podcast or you donate on our website. There's a high hosting cost and all the different fees, so I appreciate the donations as they help go towards some of that stuff to help this make more sense to do this every day. And then if you like the information we share in our podcast, so you can find more from us on our social media channels, you can find us and please follow us on Instagram and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.